The baby monitor on the marble kitchen counter of Rhett Blackwell's 42nd floor Lakeshore Drive penthouse had been screaming for 19 hours straight. Not crying, screaming. The kind of thin, desperate wail that bored straight through bulletproof glass, past 3-inch thick mahogany doors, and into the chest of a man who had once sat across the table from a Chechen warlord and not blinked. Rhett Blackwell, founder and chairman of Blackwell Strategic Group, a private intelligence and security firm valued at $2.8 billion, stood barefoot at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Lake Michigan at 3 a.m, and he had absolutely no idea what to do. Little Theo was 4 months old and starving himself to death. Not from lack of food, not from lack of money or medicine or the finest pediatric minds the University of Chicago could produce. Theo refused all of it. He would take 2, maybe 3 pulls from a bottle, then arch his back violently, turn red as a flare, and scream until his voice went raw. The top neonatologist from Lurie Children's Hospital had run every panel, every scan, every genetic workup available in 2024, and she had left 3 days ago with her hands folded apologetically and the words seared permanently into Rhett's skull. There is nothing structurally or medically wrong with this baby, Mr. Blackwell. Sometimes after severe early trauma, infants simply stop trying. She had paused on his doorstep in the November wind. I'm so sorry for your loss. His loss, as though Diane were a set of keys he had misplaced. 6 weeks ago, a precision IED had detonated under a black Suburban on Michigan Avenue. Rhett had been supposed to be in that vehicle. A last-minute call had pulled him into the office. Diane, 8 months pregnant and stubborn as weather, had taken the car to her OB appointment alone. The trauma surgeons at Northwestern Memorial had cut Theo from the wreckage of his mother's body with 11 seconds to spare. Rhett had spent the first 4 weeks systematically dismantling the network responsible. He was good at that, cold, methodical, final. What he was not good at, what no amount of classified training or operational experience had prepared him for, was standing outside a nursery at 3 a.m., listening to his infant son beg the universe for something no one could identify. Agnes Holt, the nanny Rhett had trusted for 6 years. A stiff, precise woman who had come with references from 2 senators and a federal judge, appeared in the hallway with her arms crossed, her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to lift her expression into permanent disapproval. I've tried every formula on the protocol list, Mr. Blackwell, Agnes said, her voice clipped. The agency is sending someone for the overnight shift. A temp. I can send her away if you'd prefer I stay, but I've had 4 hours of sleep in 2 days. Go. Rhett didn't look away from the window. Send the temp up. Agnes was gone before he finished the sentence. Celeste Vane arrived at 3:17 a.m. carrying a tote bag, a thermos of coffee she hadn't had time to drink, and absolutely no idea that the address the agency had given her belonged to a man whose name appeared in 12 classified federal briefings. She was 27. She had brown eyes that people described as warm until they looked close enough to see the grief sitting in them, permanent as a watermark. She wore her dark hair in a braid that had gone loose somewhere around hour 10 of her previous shift at a pediatric post-op ward in Evanston. The elevator required a key card that the night doorman had pressed into her hand with a look she couldn't read. When the doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer, she stopped. The place was enormous and brutally quiet except for the baby monitor on the kitchen island, which was relaying a sound that made her stomach drop. She had heard that sound before. For 11 days, she had sat in a NICU bay at Rush University Medical Center and listened to her daughter May make almost exactly that sound. That particular high, reedy, exhausted cry that wasn't hunger and wasn't pain but was something between the two. Something that most people, even experienced neonatal nurses, mistook for colic or reflux and treated wrong. Celeste set her tote bag on the foyer bench and followed the sound. The nursery was down a long hallway lined with abstract canvases that probably cost more than her annual salary. She pushed the door open. The room was dim, lit only by a soft nightlight, and immaculate in the way of rooms that are decorated rather than lived in. A crib sat at the center with a white canopy. In it, a tiny boy was doing exactly what she'd feared, arching his back with each shallow breath, his chin tucked wrong, his little neck extended too far as he tried and failed to pull oxygen past whatever was partially obstructing his airway every time he swallowed. Celeste's throat closed. He looked so much like May, the same translucent skin, the same frantic, searching jaw, the same exhausted set of a too small body that had been fighting too hard for too long. She didn't call for anyone. She didn't check the paperwork in her bag. She crossed the room, reached into the crib, and picked him up. She had done it 10,000 times in 11 days and then never again. Her hands remembered exactly how. She turned him carefully upright against her chest, supporting his head with her palm so his chin stayed neutral, not tucked, not extended. She pressed his sternum lightly against her collarbone, close enough that he could feel the vibration when she began to hum. Low, steady. The same three-note pattern she had hummed to May in Bay 4 of the NICU, the one the research nurses had told her didn't do anything, and that she had hummed anyway because it was the only thing she had left to give. Theo's scream hitched, caught, then like a wave running out of water it subsided. He didn't go silent. He made a small, questioning sound against her shoulder, the kind that meant, "Who are you, and why does this feel right?" "I've got you," Celeste whispered. Her voice was barely sound at all, just breath shaped into words. "You're okay. I know it's hard. I know, baby. Just breathe with me." She reached for the half-prepared bottle on the changing table. She held it at a precise angle, 45 degrees, no more, the nipple barely touching his lower lip, letting him come to it rather than bringing it to him. Pacing. Slow. Every 30 seconds she lifted the bottle away, so he could breathe without the pressure of swallowing competing with the pressure of gravity. Then 5. Then 8. He kept it down. Celeste stood in the middle of the dim nursery, rocking almost imperceptibly, tears running silently down her face in the dark, and fed a stranger's baby the way she had learned to feed her own. She didn't hear the door open behind her. She didn't see the man who filled the doorway, still wearing the dress shirt and trousers he'd had on since the day before, a glass of scotch in his hand that had gone warm and untouched. She didn't see the bodyguard, Anton, appear at his shoulder, with a hand already moving toward the firearm at his hip. She didn't see Rhett Blackwell hold up one hand, just one flat, without looking, and Anton went absolutely still. Rhett stood there. He watched his son's jaw work in steady, even rhythm. He watched the flush, faint, gradual, undeniable, begin to creep into Theo's cheeks for the first time in weeks. He watched the fists, which had been clenched since the hospital, slowly open. He stood there a long time, long enough that the scotch went from warm to room temperature, long enough that the lake outside went from black to the specific color of dark water just before dawn. Then he cleared his throat. Celeste spun around. The man in the doorway was tall in the way that meant he'd earned it, broad across the shoulders, jaw carrying 2 days of stubble, eyes the dark gray of winter water. He was not pointing anything at her, but there was a man behind him who had been about to. She registered this in the same calm, adrenaline-filled corner of her mind that 4 years in pediatric care had built specifically for emergencies. She did not put Theo down. "Who are you?" Rhett's voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that came from a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Celeste Vane, the agency sent me." She held Theo a fraction closer without meaning to. "I'm sorry the door was open. He was crying and I could hear from the hall that his airway was." She stopped. "Is he yours?" Rhett stepped fully into the room. He looked at his son with an expression that Celeste would later think she had never seen on any man before, that particular configuration of terror and tenderness that had nowhere to go because the person it belonged to was too small to receive it yet. "Yes, Rhett's mine. He has laryngomalacia." Celeste kept her voice even, professional, though nothing in her chest was even or professional right now. It's a partial collapse of the laryngeal tissue during feeding. Very common in premature infants, almost always missed on standard panels because it doesn't show up on imaging unless you're specifically looking for the dynamic movement. He's not rejecting food. He's been fighting his own airway every time he tries to swallow. He's exhausted. Rhett Blackwell, who had built a $2.8 billion company on the ability to identify the one variable every other analyst had missed, stared at a 27-year-old temp caregiver in a fraying braid, holding his son in the dark. "How do you know that?" he said. Celeste looked down at Theo. "Because my daughter had it," she said. "And I spent 11 days learning every single thing about it before I lost her." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people who have been carrying something very heavy in separate rooms suddenly find themselves in the same one. By dawn, Rhett knew everything. Preston, his head of intelligence, a wiry, meticulous man who could pull a full background in 40 minutes and had never once been wrong about a person's intentions, laid the file on the kitchen island beside a pot of coffee Celeste had made without asking, and that was inexplicably exactly how Rhett took it. Celeste Marie Vane, 27, pediatric care aide, 4 years at Evanston Northwestern, currently working agency temp shifts. No priors, no affiliations. Rent 3 months behind on a studio in Logan Square. Ex-boyfriend Derek Paulson filed a fraudulent insurance claim against her during the separation. She's contesting it in small claims court, currently unrepresented. Medical records from Rush University. delivered a premature daughter at 28 weeks, 11 months ago. The child lived 11 days. Cause of death: cardiopulmonary failure secondary to untreated laryngomalacia compounding an existing heart defect. She was working a double shift when it happened. She didn't make it back in time. Rhett set the file down. Through the glass wall of the nursery, Celeste was still sitting in the rocking chair, with Theo asleep flat against her chest. She hadn't moved in 2 hours. Her coffee had gone cold on the side table. Her eyes were closed, but Rhett could tell by the quality of her stillness that she was not sleeping. She was simply present in a way that required her full attention. "She's clean," Preston said. "I know she's clean," Rhett said. "What do I do about the landlord situation?" Preston looked at him for a moment. "That's not usually my department." "It is now." The conversation happened in the kitchen at 7 a.m., while Theo slept for the first time in 3 weeks in a real uninterrupted stretch that made the baby monitor sound like silence. Rhett sat across from Celeste and told her what Preston had found. She went pale, then composed herself with a speed that told him she was used to being blindsided and had learned to absorb it on her feet. "You had my background pulled," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a fact she was cataloguing." "I pull every background." "What do you want?" He told her. The nursing situation, the undiagnosed condition, the month of failed specialists. The salary, a number that made her set her coffee cup down carefully, as though she was afraid her hands might shake. The suite next to the nursery, the car, the security detail, which she would not be able to refuse. "You'd be staying here," he said, "indefinitely. You don't clean this apartment, you don't do anything except take care of Theo." He paused. "Your debts disappear. Paulson's claim gets handled." Celeste looked at the baby monitor. The small green light blinked steadily. Theo's breathing was even and deep. She had nothing left in Logan Square except a studio with a broken radiator and a box under the bed that held a yellow onesie she couldn't bring herself to donate. She had 11 days of knowing exactly how to love a baby with this particular fight in him, and here was a baby with that exact fight who needed her. "Okay," she said. The weeks that followed remade the penthouse from the inside out. Theo gained 4 ounces the first week, 8 the week after. He began tracking Celeste's face across the room with those dark, serious eyes of his, turning his head when he heard her voice the way babies turn toward warmth. The bruised blue shadows under his skin softened into something that the pediatric consultant, called back for a follow-up visit, described with the word remarkable, in a tone that meant he had not expected it. Rhett was there for most of it. He had a company to run, encrypted servers in the den, secure calls at odd hours, men who came and went with faces that gave nothing away. But in the evenings he came to the nursery. He sat in the chair by the window and watched Celeste feed Theo with that precise, patient technique that she made look effortless. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. Celeste had learned to read his silences the way you learn to read a room, not by what was said, but by where the weight was sitting. He asked about May once. Just once, because he could see it cost her something every time someone made her say it out loud. She told him without flinching, in the spare, careful language of someone who has had to describe an unbearable thing enough times to sand the edges down. He listened the way very few people listen, completely, without preparing his response. After he said, she had someone who fought for her. 11 days is a long time to fight. Celeste didn't cry. She had done all her crying alone at 3 a.m. in the room next door where no one could see. But something unknotted in her chest, and she was not sure it had been knotted before that moment, or whether she had simply stopped noticing. Agnes Holt watched all of this from the margins with an expression Celeste could not quite place. The older woman had been demoted from primary caregiver to household administrator, a shift Rhett had made without comment on Celeste's first full day. Agnes had accepted it with a smile that sat wrong on her face, too flat at the corners, held slightly too long. Celeste noticed. Surviving 4 years in pediatric care alongside overworked, territorial senior staff had given her a finely tuned sense of when a smile was a threat wearing a different coat. The thing that confirmed it was a Tuesday night, 2 weeks in. Celeste was in the pantry off the nursery checking Theo's formula supply when she noticed one of the sealed canisters had been moved. She kept them in a very specific order, a habit left over from the NICU, where everything had a sequence because sequence was the only control you had. This canister had been replaced at a slightly different angle. The seal strip was re-adhered, not factory pressed. She popped the canister open and smelled it. Under the formula's sharp, powdery sweetness, there was something chemical, bitter, faintly astringent, like cheap acetone cut with something sweeter. Celeste stood very still in the fluorescent light of the pantry with the open canister in her hands, and the pieces landed the way pieces land when you've been a caregiver long enough to understand that the thing presenting as mysterious is almost never actually mysterious. Theo's laryngomalacia was real. She had no doubt about that, but laryngomalacia would have made him struggle, not spiral. Something had been accelerating his decline. Something had been added. She heard a sound behind her. Agnes Holt stood in the pantry doorway in her robe, her grey hair loose, holding a compact and ugly black pistol that she had clearly not purchased from any legitimate source. "You have very good instincts," Agnes said. Her voice was the same clipped professional tone she used for everything, as though she were noting an item on a checklist. "That's the problem." Celeste's hands were steady. She had been terrified before, real bone-deep terrified, and she had learned that terror is most useful when you don't let it reach your face. Celeste said, "How long?" 3 weeks before you arrived." Agnes stepped into the pantry, kicking the door shut behind her. The gun was level and unhurried, just enough of a compound to suppress his sucking reflex and trigger a secondary inflammatory response, untraceable in standard tox screens. Mimics neurological failure to thrive. The specialists would have called it SIDS eventually. These things happen to premature babies. She tilted her head. "You weren't supposed to be here. You were supposed to be a nobody from an agency who would last 3 days, confirm the baby was beyond help, and leave. Who told you to do this?" Agnes smiled the same wrong-cornered smile. "Someone who stands to receive $6 million when Diane Blackwell's estate trust is dissolved, which requires the beneficiary, little Theo, to predecease his 2nd birthday." The name came to Celeste the way the formula's smell had, not as a revelation but as a confirmation of something she had been circling without knowing it. "Cordelia Ashford," Celeste said. Diane's younger sister. She had visited twice since Celeste moved in, a tall woman with Diane's cheekbones and none of Diane's warmth, who had looked at Theo with an expression that lasted just a fraction of a second too long before becoming appropriately grieving aunt. Agnes raised the pistol. "Put the canister down," Agnes said, "and step away from the shelf. I'm going to make this look like you had a breakdown. Grief does terrible things. Everyone will understand." Celeste looked at the open canister still in her hands. It was 3 pounds of sealed metal with a pressure-fitted lid. She had spent 11 days learning that sometimes the only thing between a baby and the worst possible outcome is the person who refuses to step away from the shelf. She did not step away. She swung the canister. The edge of the lid connected with Agnes's wrist at the exact angle needed to break her grip on the pistol. The gun skittered sideways across the tile. Agnes screamed and lunged, and Celeste threw her shoulder into the older woman's sternum, slamming her back into the shelving. Canisters crashed. Agnes clawed for Celeste's arm, and Celeste grabbed the first heavy thing she could reach, a solid steel baby formula mixing pitcher, and drove the flat base into the side of Agnes's knee. Agnes went down screaming. Celeste kicked the gun to the far corner of the pantry, grabbed the open canister as evidence, and ran for the nursery door. She had her hand on the knob when the penthouse's emergency lights blazed to life, and the front door came off its frame. Rhett Blackwell was not supposed to be back until morning. Preston had said the client meeting in Milwaukee would run until midnight at the earliest, but Rhett stood in the hallway with Anton and Kofi flanking him, and a look on his face that Celeste had never seen before. Not the controlled neutrality he wore for everything, but something raw and searingly focused, like a signal stripped down to its purest frequency. "Nursery is clear," Anton called from behind Rhett. "The baby is fine, boss. Sleeping." Rhett's eyes moved from Celeste, disheveled, breathing hard, still gripping the canister, to the open pantry door, where Agnes was sobbing on the tile surrounded by scattered supplies. "The formula," Celeste said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that. "It's been tampered with since before I got here. There's a compound in it. I don't know what exactly, but Preston will be able to identify it. Agnes was paid to do it. Cordelia Ashford gave the order." She held the canister out to Rhett. "I think if you run a tox screen on this batch, you'll finally have the proof you need." Rhett took the canister. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he handed it to Preston, who had appeared at his shoulder with an evidence bag already open, because Preston was the kind of man who always had an evidence bag already open. He crossed to Agnes. He crouched down in front of the woman who had been in his household for 6 years, who had references from senators and a federal judge, who had stood in his nursery and called herself devoted while she measured out poison in quarter-milliliter increments. Cordelia Ashford. Yes or no? Agnes looked at him and made one calculation. Yes. Rhett stood. Kofi, take her downstairs. Keep her conscious. I'll need her statement for the estate attorney. He turned then to the nursery window. Through the glass, the baby monitor light blinked its steady green. Theo was asleep on his back, arms loose and open, breathing with the slow assurance of a baby who had finally stopped fighting. Rhett stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides. Then he turned to Celeste, and she saw the thing she had seen once before in him, that grief held too long in a body built to hold nothing soft. It was cracking through the edges now, just barely, just enough. "You could have called me," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "You didn't have to." "There wasn't time," Celeste said, "and I wasn't going to step away." He looked at her in the way that meant he was not looking at her profession or her history or the agency's file on her, but at the specific person who had stood in a pantry with a steel pitcher instead of stepping away. A long, considering look that she felt somewhere behind her sternum. "No," he said. "You weren't, Cordelia." "The $6 million from Diane's estate trust," Celeste said. "Agnes told me. If Theo doesn't survive to his second birthday, the trust dissolves and the money reverts to the family." Rhett nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he was not surprised, but was cataloguing the depth of something. "She was at the funeral. She held him." He stopped. "I need to make a call." The call was not to Cordelia Ashford. It was to Cordelia Ashford's estate attorney, her financial auditor, and the federal agent who had been quietly investigating the chain of shell companies through which the estate trust was structured, and whom Preston had been feeding information to for 11 days. By the following morning, when Cordelia arrived at the penthouse in a cream-colored coat with the carefully calibrated expression of a woman arriving to check on a nephew she was concerned about, she was met in the lobby by 2 federal agents and a warrant. Celeste watched from the penthouse security monitor. She had Theo on her shoulder. He was awake and doing the thing he had recently discovered he could do, which was grab a fistful of her braid and hold on with remarkable determination for someone who weighed 11 pounds. "She doesn't look scared enough," Celeste said. "She will," Rhett said from the desk, not looking up from the document he was signing. "Fear's a delayed reaction in people who've been certain they were the smartest person in every room. It hits when they realize they weren't." Theo yanked the braid. Celeste winced and laughed at the same time, and Rhett looked up at the laugh specifically, which he had heard in small amounts over the past weeks, and which was doing something to the quality of the air in whatever room it happened in. "He's getting strong," Rhett said. "He's getting obnoxious," Celeste said warmly. "He has opinions now, very strong opinions about the braid." Rhett set the pen down. He stood and crossed the room, not to the desk or the window, but to where Celeste was standing with his son. He reached out and put one hand gently against the back of Theo's head, a gesture so natural and so unfamiliar on him that Celeste held very still, as though moving might startle it away. Theo turned toward his father's warmth with that serious, searching look, and then seemed to decide Rhett passed whatever assessment he was conducting, because he released Celeste's braid and grabbed Rhett's finger instead. Something crossed Rhett's face that she didn't have a word for. Something that was not grief and not relief, but what happens in the small space between them when both are finally starting to lift. "I want to talk to you about your arrangement here," Rhett said. He was looking at Theo, not at her. "The agency contract runs out in 2 weeks. I don't want to renew it." Celeste's chest tightened. "Okay." He looked at her then. "Not as staff, not as a contractor. I want you to stay because my son needs you and because..." He stopped, started again, which she had never once seen him do. "Because this house has been dead for 6 weeks, and you walked into it at 3 in the morning and started it up again, and I don't know what to call that except something I'm not willing to lose." The lake was silver through the windows. Theo was still gripping Rhett's finger with complete conviction, the way babies grip things, without strategy, without reservation, simply because the grip feels right. Celeste thought about the studio in Logan Square, and the box under the bed, and the 11 days she had spent learning how to love something that small and that brave. She thought about the fact that she had come here with a thermos of cold coffee, and no idea what she was walking into, and had somehow ended up here, in this kitchen of impossible light, holding a baby who had just learned that the world could be navigated after all. "Okay," she said, "I'll stay." Rhett let out a breath. Just one, slow, deliberate breath, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying in his arms for a very long time. Theo made a sound. Not a cry, not a fuss, just a small, assertive announcement of presence, the sound of a baby who has decided the room belongs to him and sees no reason to be quiet about it. Celeste laughed again. And in the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, in the grey November light over a lake that had no interest in anyone's grief or their resilience, saw the slow, unscheduled way love finds its way back into rooms that have gone dark. Something shifted, quietly, irrevocably, into something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like the beginning of a life rather than the remainder of one.